Hi there. Today we're going to be working on a still life. What you will need is your 16 by 20 canvas. I have a cadmium red medium, ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow medium, white, black, and then any kind of earth tone, brownish. I chose raw sienna. You don't need a lot of paint, just the basics today. If there are other colors that you feel like using, go for it. But I'm going to stick to these basics as they are available in pretty much all of your intro sets. So we're doing still lifes. We're working mostly from cylindrical shapes. So I'm going to show you the setup that I have. I chose 4 objects. I've set them up. I've put a piece of butcher paper up behind it and taped it up because behind there is actually a big window and it shows just the outdoors and it's a bit distracting and overwhelming. So that's just a background that will keep things from getting too confusing. So for my first step, what I'm going to do is called imprimatura. Oh, and as well as our paints, I have a paper palette. You may use a plastic one or a glass one. And then just a jar of water. That's what we'll be using as a medium. And then paper towel for drying. So I'm using my raw sienna. You can use yellow ochre, a burnt umber if you'd like. And I'm going to add some water to it, thin it out. And I'm going to be covering the whole canvas. And this is called imprimatura. That's the fancy term for it, which is just Italian for first paint. And the idea being that if you're painting directly onto the white, it can be difficult to move all the way down to your lowest values and up to your highlights. If you've done any drawing before in charcoal or pencil, graphite, oftentimes it's easier to cover the whole page and then use your eraser to put in your highlights and then build up more graphite or charcoal to do your darker areas. So it's just a thin layer. You'll notice as you're doing it that little bits on your canvas are going to want to poke through. So just be patient, keep going. If you've ever painted a wall inside your house, if you only do one coat, you'll notice later the little bits peeking. So just patiently keep going. Again, it can be pretty thin. This is just so you don't have any glaring bright white coming through. So you're going to cover your whole canvas. And then while you're letting that dry, what I like to do is I like to start sketching. So I feel like if I was to just start putting my pencil lines right onto my canvas, I often do things that I kind of regret. Perhaps my layout's not quite right, or I haven't really spent enough time looking at what I'm about to paint to really know the relationship between things. So I like to do a bunch of thumbnail sketches that don't have to be perfect at all. Really, the point for me in doing them is to get my eye used to looking around at my objects, seeing where everything is, seeing where things are in relation to each other. All right, so this is basically done. I might just do a couple more spots here and there. But again, it doesn't need to be perfect. The paint can change over the surface. The idea is just that, excuse me, it's no longer all white. So, all right, so now that I feel confident about my drawing and my composition, I can start moving it onto my canvas. And so I like to think a lot about the composition. I don't want to have a little tiny arrangement of objects. I also, for this painting, don't want to have them too big where they're spilling over the sides. So I think about how I have them on the page, how I want to move it here. I'll make this a little larger. And so I go in, and this doesn't have to be perfect. I want it to be pretty close. But once I move into painting, I'll have a lot of room. So I'll just start getting these basic shapes in. Since I'll be painting over this, there's really no reason to put in too much detail right now. Just get basic idea of where objects are. The next step is going to be to block in. All right, so now that I have my pencil lines down, I like where my objects are, I'm starting to block in some basic colors. So right now I'm putting in some shadow, and this is just going to be a flat color all the way across. Now to make this color in the candlestick, this is a mixture of yellow, a little bit of my brown, some of the blue, some white, and some black. And now that I want to do, I feel like this is looking fine for that. I want to put in some of the shadow on this pot, which is bluer. A lot of times the inclination when putting in a shadow can be to add a lot of black, but you can get a truer feeling deep shadow kind of by getting there through browns. So throwing a little bit of red, some more of my blue, and then sometimes, yes, you will want to be adding some black. So now I'm just going to block this in. And again, we're just doing really basic shapes. And this is just to have something down that we can build on later. I'm just using water to thin my paint out a little bit. Trying to stay within the lines, but I'm not being too crazy about it. Do up here. All right, so I'm going to fill some more in and then show you how to move on from there. All right, so I'd like to show you something that happened while blocking. So I've been using a lot of water, really thinning out my paint so I can just get this thin wash down. And as you can see, there's a little too much water there. In fact, it started, I could see like a little line of water along the bottom, and I got nervous that it was going to start to drip. So if that happens to you, what I do is I just take a little crumbled up piece of paper towel and just dry it up, and then you don't have drips. So one of the things that I love about acrylics is that they dry really quickly. So with oil paint, a lot of the beauty is that you can blend the colors into each other. But one of the things about acrylics is that you don't have to wait to blend. You can just layer over and over and over, which I think can be really great. So, and I want to encourage you again, not to use black and white in your colors. Because once you take a color, not to use them too much, once you add some white to something, you kind of will start going down a path with it. So I kind of save white and black for the end. But again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself right now. I don't need to be worried about that. I'm just getting the colors in. All right, so if your paint is too watery, you can just dry it up with a piece of paper towel. Now I'm gonna start going in to the background, because while this color that I put down for the Imprimatura is pretty close to the paper I was using, it's still a really thin washi coat, and I feel like this painting deserves a little more. So the more layers you add on, the more depth you can be giving. So I'll start, that's a little too red. I'll start going in and mixing some of my brown, a little bit of red, a little bit of blue. And then I'll start putting this in, again, blocking in the colors. All right, so I will check back in once I have the whole canvas blocked in. All right, so here you can see I have the underpainting done, and the color blocking. So I have my basic forms figured out, and they're basic colors. There are still parts like around the lip of this form that I haven't put any color down besides that Imprimatura layer that I put down initially. And so now from here, I let it dry completely. I, went and had lunch. And now I'm going to go back in and start to kind of model the forms. These all are kind of blocky. So I will start mixing up some of my paints, and we'll start over here. And again, I'm going to work kind of thin. So these are kind of, the colors I'm doing are a little transparent right now. Start to and I'm still not using too small a brush because I'm not worried about details yet. We will go back in and take care of those little details in the next step. And once I start getting into a smaller and smaller brush, it can be easy to kind of go down a rabbit hole with that. You end up just getting teensy tiny, really almost a little neurotic, or at least I do. So and I just keep adding little different dabs of brown where I want it to be darker. And I can start blending. So I've just rounded out my forms a little more. I haven't put in my really bright highlights and my really dark shadows. Instead, I've just been trying to make things a bit more solid feeling. So you can see how like this starts to feel like it has some volume. There's still some work that I need to do over here. This is feeling pretty good. But if you look, there are some highlights that I need to take care of. And I can also tighten up some of these little shadows. So right now what I've done is I've gotten the shapes more filled out, and I'm gonna let this dry, and then we'll go in and do things like, you see here, I'm gonna wanna clean that up. This will have to come in under the lip a little bit. And over here, you see this doesn't look quite right, and that's okay. It'll be really easy to move that line back in. And like over here, I'm really pleased with how that moves. But over here, I feel like I need to push the blue over. And that's okay, we can do it. So I'm gonna let this dry, and then the next stage will be adding in some bright highlights, some darker shadows, and then finessing any lines that I think are out of place to make my forms feel more realistic and solid. All right, so now that the forms have been filled out pretty well, it's time to work on our shadows. So we're gonna do that. I'll demonstrate on this orange vessel. And if you remember, when doing shadows, you have your core shadow on the vessel itself. So I'm going to take my kind of orangey color that I've made, add some brown, a little bit of blue, not adding black to it yet because I don't need to get really that dark. Even I'll just add like a little bit of red. I just want to take this color and keep going down. If I were to add black to it, if you remember with your shades and tints, it wouldn't be true to the shadow that I'm seeing right now as I look over at my objects. The actual color I'm seeing is more of like a blued out, muddy orange. So, getting the color that I feel like is looking a little better. And so my core shadow on my vessel is really up in here. It kind of falls down here. And then kind of the body of the shadow. And then it even comes over here a little bit. Then out along the outside, gets a little darker. I can kind of make my edge. I'm using a same brush, kind of cleaning it off a little. Then I can scrub my paint a little bit to make everything a little softer. This is such a rounded vessel that a lot of my shadow lines are going to be really diffuse. Don't have any hard edges. However, if you look down at the occlusion shadow down here, which is where the vessel and the table meet, that is where your darkest shadow will be. I will use a little bit of black down here. And this is really where the two objects meet. Sometimes the bottom of your object and the surface, there's so little light there, it's all shaded, that the two objects become hard to distinguish from each other as they're all just in shadow. And then the shadow will get, as it turns into the cast shadow, is going to get a lot lighter. I'm not going to be adding white to that part yet. I'll add more of like an ochre. I see a little bit of blue in there too, to kind of see where my shadow moves out. I'm going to darken that up with a bit more blue and red. And so I'll keep going back and forth between my darkest occlusion shadow And my cast shadow, see how it comes into this object, and then this shadow here. I'm gonna just play with these. And then we have, in addition to these shadows, we have all of the light that is reflected from the surface of the ground back up onto our vessels. And so, like down here, there's a lightness that happens. So I'll come in, I'll even add a little bit of watered down white maybe. So as I'm starting to get my reflected light, now, once I have those where I like them, I'm not quite done, but I'm gonna now show you if I feel like doing some of those big highlights that really help to make a shiny image start to feel more realistic. Take my color, it's gonna be mostly white in this instance. I'm gonna add some yellow, tiny bit of red. And compared to everything else in the painting, this will start to feel like some pure white, but it's not. It has a lot of other colors added to it. So we have it going up along the lip, and now you can start using your more finely detailed brush. There's some that kind of goes dotted down here, and then moving over this way. These kind of highlights are what really start to make these shapes fill out, feel a lot more solid. So I'm just looking back at my object, seeing where these nice highlights are. You know, sometimes you'll even see like the reflection of a window in the object. I'm not going to go into that much detail. But you can see how these really help an object start to feel more complete. I need to clean up this lip a lot more, but I know already that there's going to be a big highlight on this vessel that kind of comes down and swoops down here. So putting in these highlights starts to be really fun. All right, so we are in the home stretch now. I've done things like put in my little highlights, fixed up some shadows. I went in and even put some texture in this pot, which was really just a matter of messing around with different brushes. It has kind of a mottled look. Then I even come back in with my finger. Acrylics are safe to touch with your hands. Oils, you wouldn't want to do this. And then there are a couple of things that I just want to kind of take care of. As I step back from the painting and take a bigger look, I see that things get confused about what's background, what's foreground, what is behind the objects, what are they resting on. So I want to add more of the dark background kind of through here. Also, I don't really like how there's like this darkness outlining my candlestick, so I'll go and add a little more here, just so there isn't that line going around it. Same there. And then other little things that I might want to consider, like the top of my candlestick. This is a time for doing little fine details. So kind of like how we had with the highlights, you may just want to crisp things up a little bit to kind of give a little more precision. And so that's pretty much how you can work, moving from generalizations, your main colors, main shapes, big shadows, and then get closer and closer until you're doing these little details. And then I like to back out one last time, kind of look at the big picture and see if anything isn't quite making sense. Sometimes while looking at the objects, you'll be so close that you'll be reading, you know, like a shadow here, but then when you step away, you realize it just doesn't quite add up. So it's good to be working up close, get your little details, and then allow yourself to back up. So I'll just keep on adding my darker background, lighter foreground, which will really help locate these. And then I feel like I'm done. Probably let everything do one more round of drying and then just see if there are any little spots that I want to go back in and fix. Let's see, do still a little lighter up here, kind of. So that's even softening things. One thing in this painting that I would like to point out, the way I have my objects set up, there's a light source right here, but then there's also the window. And so there is this light also coming over here, hitting that pot, which now you see we kind of have two light sources. It makes sense in this particular painting, but if you only have one light source, then your objects will look a lot different.